This is Dr. Robert Murphy. He's an economist. He's very well renowned in the world of libertarianism. He's an associate scholar at the Mises Institute and various other think tanks. He's the author of several books, including the Politically Incorrect Guide to Capitalism, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Great Depression, the Human Action Study Guide, as well as the textbook Lessons for the Young Economists. So we're really, really honored for you to be here with us, and we'll just let you take it away.
All right, well, thanks, everybody. Pleasure to be here, and I was talking with Zach. I think the best thing to do for this, so we're celebrating Mises' birthday, and let me just hit a few sort of prepared remarks where I'll just give you a basic framework, and I'll do that. I'll shoot for doing that for 30 minutes, and then I'll turn it over to your guys' questions. So let me set my alarm, because as a recovering college professor, if I just start going, I'm not going to stop. So let me set my alarm so I'll make sure I stop and give you. All right. All right, so just to prepare yourself mentally here, I'm going to hit 4 main subject areas: methodology, money, calculation, and consumer sovereignty. So there's 4 areas of Mises' thought. Incidentally, just as background, if you want the definitive biography to know not only the great personal story behind Mises, I mean, it's really a fascinating story if you don't know it. He he served in the Austro-Hungarian artillery during World War I. Okay, so I've often thought, can you imagine if Ludwig von Mises was in charge of trying to shell you behind enemy lines? You know, that would be pretty terrifying if you knew the guy sending rockets your way was Mises. But beyond that, then in World War II, or leading up to World War II, he was persecuted by the Nazis he had like a double whammy. That on the one hand, he was a Jewish intellectual out of Austria, so obviously the Nazi regime didn't like that. But then even worse is he was a classical liberal. All right, and so Mises was one of the few people in Europe at the time who was standing up proudly for what we call classical liberalism, meaning the free market and individual rights perspective at the time. And so he had to flee. So it's a fascinating story how he and his fiance had to go to Switzerland and so forth, and they finally came to the United States. And then his personal library, first the Nazis got it because they took over his stuff after he left Europe, and then when the Soviets defeated the Nazis, they captured it. And so a bunch of Mises' personal papers were just sitting there with the Soviets for a while, until finally some people went over there and sort of bribed their way past guards to take pictures of it and so on. So anyway, it's a neat little sort of Indiana Jones type story in terms of his personal life. The place to get all that would be Guido Hülsmann's biography called The Last Night of Liberalism on Mises. Okay, so that's the book I would recommend, because Hülsmann, not only does he know all the personal details, but also is a trained economist who's also very familiar with the Austrian school. Guido Hülsmann is able to accurately explain Mises' contributions to economic theory. So if you're just going to read one book, that's the one to go to. Okay, so in the time we have here, instead of me focusing on his personal life, let me just focus on his academic contributions to economics. So as far as methodology, what do we mean by that term? It means if you're writing on what is the proper method to use in economics. So how do we do economics? What does it mean to do good economics? Okay, what makes economics a discipline? And is it the same type of enterprise as physics or chemistry? What are the boundary lines of it, and so on? So Mises, the special word here is called praxeology. And just so you know, in case when I was younger, I used to think this stuff is all philosophy. Let's just get into the heart of Mises' economics. I don't really care about these sort of methodological writings, but the older I got, the more I studied him, the more I understood why he thought this was so important. All right, because he was where he's coming from is to say, look, if you don't know what the foundation of economics is, then you're building on quicksand. Just like you wouldn't build a house without a solid foundation. By the same token, if you just dive right into talking about money or the business cycle without explaining what is economics and what's the proper method to use in economics, then you're just building it on quicksand. And that was particularly relevant because when he was writing, Marxism was much, I think, more dominant than it is in our time. And so there were challenges that the Marxists were leveling against economic theory per se, right? They weren't just saying, oh, we disagree with free market economists on this particular empirical point. No, they were challenging the very notion of what economics was, saying that, you economists have no business telling government officials what they can and can't do, the limits of their power. And so Mises was trying to establish the legitimacy of economics as its own discipline. Okay, so to that end, what Mises did is he thought what we all think of as economics, talking about markets and money and prices and stuff like that, he thought that that was a subset of a broader branch of knowledge called praxeology, which was the scientific study of human action per se. Okay, and so so for Mises, this, what praxeology was saying that you logically spin out conclusions from the fact that humans act. And now that term act, that verb to act there, what Mises meant by that was purposeful behavior. Okay, so just to make sure you understand that, if what it means is when you have a subjective goal and you adopt a means to achieve it, that is action. And so if we're looking at a rock and it falls from a height and it's falling and you can see it moving, accelerating down, the moving, but it's acting, right? You don't attribute intentions to it. All right. On the other hand, if you see a plane that's circling and then it comes in for a landing in an airport, you can see intentionality there. You think there's some conscious being in control of that. You think there's a pilot. And you might not be sure whether there's a pilot inside or whether there's a pilot somewhere else who's flying the thing with remote control. Okay, so you might not know that particular detail, but the point is you see something there beyond just mere mechanistic behavior. Okay, and even for a human being, there's a distinction between just reflexive behavior and action. So if you're just standing there and someone comes up and blows pepper in your face and you sneeze, that your body is behaving there, it's moving, but that's not so much that you thought, oh, it would be a good idea for me to sneeze right now, and so I'm going to do that. Okay, so whereas just about all sorts of other things you could do, the way we would interpret that is to say, oh, there's intentional behavior there. So just to give you, if you see my hand come out and the fingers close around a glass of water and then it comes up to my mouth and I tilt it and the water goes into my body, you're going to say stuff like, oh, that's action. He's doing that on purpose. And then you might speculate and say, well, maybe he's thirsty. Okay, so this is real commonplace stuff, but I'm trying to get you to make sure you understand what human action is in Mises' sense. Okay, so if that's what it is, Mises was saying there's a lot we can deduce from that, the existence of that thing, of that type of phenomenon. And so just to give you an idea of what I mean, just take that example of my hand going around a glass of water and going like this. If we're going to interpret that as action, right? So if example, nowadays we wouldn't say, oh, the sky gods were angry, or the clouds had too much moisture and they didn't like that, they wanted to get rid of some of it, or the water droplets really wanted to come down to the ground, and that you wouldn't use that language of intention to explain just purely natural phenomena. Okay, but you would use intentional language to talk about me drinking that water. And so there's components of that. If you start pushing it through, for you to even explain what you just saw as me acting in the way that Mises used that term, it carries some implications with it. So for example, that I have a mind, that I have subjective goals, right? It wouldn't make sense to say that, oh yeah, Murphy is drinking that glass of water on purpose, if you didn't think that I had my own subjective desires or goals, right? Just like it would be weird to say, oh, it's raining because the clouds don't like having that much water. We wouldn't talk like that because we don't think that the clouds have desires at all. Okay, so there's one element there. It also requires that you think I have reason, and that I have a view of the world of cause and effect. And so, for example, you might say, oh, maybe he's thirsty, right? So just that everyday observation or explanation to say, oh yeah, the reason he's doing that is because he's thirsty. If you think about it, that only makes sense if you think that I believe drinking water alleviates thirst, right? If I didn't know that, then, you know, so if I were poisoned, let's say, and you see me fumbling for a little vial and I drink it, and you're trying to explain that outcome, and you say, oh yeah, it's because he was poisoned, and so that's why he drank that antidote. I mean, there, part of that explanation, even if you don't spell it out, is that the person doing it, recognize that cause and effect relationship. That, oh, if I've just been poisoned, I have to drink that antidote to help me. So it's not merely enough to say I have the subjective goal of not dying from the poison, but that I also need to have that cause and effect relationship. I might be wrong, by the way. If you see me drink something that's labeled antidote, and I drink it and I die, and then someone says, oh, it wasn't an antidote, somebody was just playing a joke, and they put that label on there, too bad for him. But that still makes sense to explain that outcome as action. Okay? So because the crucial thing is not whether my belief is correct or not, it's the fact that you're attributing a belief to me in the first place. Okay, so I don't want to get bogged down too much on this. I just want to give you the flavor of what I mean when I say the fact that we decide to label something as an action, it starts spitting out consequences that are necessary to that, but they're not. It's not something you would empirically test. Okay, so let me just make sure you get that point. The kind of analysis I just did right there, you can see the way in which, yeah, if you're going to interpret my behavior as human action, then those implications necessarily start popping out. That, okay, yeah, if you're going to explain that as purposeful behavior, then you're assuming he has goals, you're assuming he has some view of cause and effect, you're assuming he thinks that he can influence the future of the universe. Things like that, they pop out, but it's not that you would go test that stuff. It's not that you would say, oh yeah, in all the cases that I've studied empirically, when someone had goals, it meant that, and they behaved purposefully, it meant that they necessarily had a view of what cause and effect was in that particular situation. You wouldn't go test it like that. It would just flow automatically from that. Okay, and that kind of relationship is how Mises thought we derived economic laws. So, and the phrase here, in case you read up on this stuff, is called a priori, and this is probably the most controversial element of his thought. That's why I'm spending so much time on the front end on this, is because I want to make sure you understand it. What Mises was saying is the type of knowledge we can derive in economics in terms of like economic principles or laws. It's knowledge about reality. It's real knowledge that helps us understand the objective world, or out there, if you want to talk like that. But it's not something that we get from experiments or empirical observation. So physicists and chemists and biologists, a lot of their knowledge they've derived over the years through testing and observation, and it could have been the other way around. That relies on empirical measurements that we can logically imagine a different type of universe in which those numbers were different, right? The charge on an electron, we can imagine, could have been a little bit different, and they just had to go measure that to see what it was. But the sorts of things that the laws of economics thinks are not like that. They're more analogous to geometry, to results in geometry, where the Pythagorean theorem, for example, it's not obvious. You would need someone to teach that to you. You wouldn't just be sitting there and grasp the Pythagorean theorem effortlessly. It's a proof that you need to have demonstrated to you. But the point is, you don't prove it by going and measuring 1,000 triangles and seeing that, oh yeah, that result is true, in every triangle I've ever measured in my life. That's not the way you prove something in geometry. So that's the kind of analogy we might use for economics. So why is all that important? Because Mises thought that's the way you do good economics, and he wasn't prescribing that. He was describing what he thought economists had been doing in the 1800s and early 1900s when he started writing on this stuff. All right, so he wasn't some idiosyncratic guy trying to get economists to do things his way. He was trying to show everyone this is what we do when we're doing good economics, and we should stop thinking we need to be like the physicists. Okay, last thing, and then I'll move on to the next point here. I just want to clarify. Sometimes people hear that type of description that I just gave, and they'll say, oh my gosh, so you're saying Mises didn't think empirical measurement was at all necessary? He didn't think you needed to study economic history? And no, that's not correct. Mises was making a distinction, though, between economic theory and history. He was actually involved in founding a center to study business cycles. Right, that was one of the things he did, and Hayek joined him in that. All right, so Mises was not against looking at the numbers when it came to economics. It was just he was trying to say, don't think that we have to act like the physicists. Economics is its own special discipline, and the way we learn laws is through this technique. Okay, a huge contribution he made, so now I'm moving on to money, is Mises solved a problem that, so let me just spend a minute or two here to make sure you see what the problem was, and then I'll explain to you how Mises solved it. So the founder of the Austrian school, Karl Menger, as well as William Stanley Jevons and Leon Walras, they are credited with what's called the marginal revolution. All right, so if you go to Wikipedia or you go to some standard encyclopedia of economics and you type in the marginal revolution, they will say, oh, that was an event in the early 1870s where three separate economists independently discovered the new subjective marginal value theory that replaced the classical cost or labor theory of value. Okay, so this was an advance in economic theory in the early 1870s where the way the classical economists had explained market prices, relying on an objective notion, like to say, oh, the reason two goods will trade for each other in the marketplace is they both have the same amount of something, and that's why they're equal. And that's why you see that equality in terms, and that's why they exchange for each other in the marketplace. And they differed on what that substance was that was in them. And some said, oh, it's the cost, and some said, oh, well, it's kind of like the amount of labor that went into them. But the subjective marginal revolution said, no, the way you evaluate goods is in the mind of the beholder, and so that's the starting point. When we want to explain market prices, it's that when people go to buy something, they subjectively value the item, saying, how can this thing be useful to me? And the reason that word marginal is in there is because you value stuff on the margin. And so the classic way to illustrate that is what's called the water-diamond paradox, where water is certainly essential for human life. So you think if you're valuing things based on are they useful to humans, you would think water would be super valuable. Diamonds are pretty, but they actually aren't that useful in the grand scheme of things. You put them on a rock on or you put them on a ring on your finger, or you put them on earrings or something. But what do we use diamonds for? Water, you think would be far more valuable. And yet in the marketplace, of course, diamonds command a much higher unit price than water does. And so why is that? And the explanation has to do with, you got to think on the margin, that any particular gallon of water actually isn't very useful. It's not important. If it could disappear, and humanity wouldn't care in general, because we have so many gallons of water relative to our uses for it, that on the margin, the disappearance of 1 gallon of water is no big deal. Whereas the disappearance of one gallon jug full of diamonds, that would be a big deal, right? Whether you had 1 extra gallon jug of diamonds or not, that would be a huge deal to whoever got it. Okay, and so that's the crucial insight to understanding market pricing. Okay, so Karl Menger, founder of the Austrian school, is one of the 3 economists who ushered in that new way of thinking in the early 1870s. And so that gradually percolated around, and economists over the next few decades just completely revolutionized their thinking, and they realized that, yes, this is the starting point, this is the way to think about market prices. And then they could imagine hypothetical barter economies, and they could price everything accordingly using these new techniques. But the problem was they couldn't handle money very well in that framework. So they knew that this approach for explaining market prices or exchange ratios in the marketplace made much more sense than what the classical economists have been doing. So this is the way to go. But they could only really explain things in terms of barter. So they could explain why 7 chickens would trade for 1 cow and things like that in a hypothetical economy where people just directly traded goods against each other with no money. But then when they said, okay, in the real world, of course, people don't trade chickens directly for cows. They sell them for money, and then they use the money to go buy the other thing. So how do we explain that? And they thought this new approach didn't work in that setting because they thought they were arguing in a circle. They were saying, look at the essential insight of the subjective revolution is to say the starting point for valuation is someone goes to the marketplace, sees something, and then says, how does that give me utility? And then everything proceeds from there. So they said, and that's how we build up the explanation of what the thing's relative value is in terms of market exchange. You start from its subjective value, its usefulness to the individual. And so they said, okay, with money though, when you look at a gold coin and you say, okay, why would I be willing to give up my cow for a gold coin in the marketplace? You could say, well, first you look at that gold coin and you say, how much subjective value does it give to me? And that's the starting point. But the problem is, gee, since it's money, the reason I value it is that it has purchasing power. The reason I would give up my cow for that gold coin is that I know I could take that gold coin and go buy a lot of other types of things in the market that I value more than the cow. And so ultimately, I'm trading my cow for those other things, and the gold coin is just kind of like a middleman or a go-between. All right, so the problem was it looked like you were arguing in a circle. It looked like you were saying, if you were going to use this new approach to money, it looked like you were saying, oh, the reason money has purchasing power, the way we explain its purchasing power is you start out with its subjective value, and how do you subjectively value money? Oh, you look at what its purchasing power is. So it looked like you were using the subjective, or you were explaining the purchasing power of money by reference to the purchasing power of money. And so it looked like they were hitting a dead end. So that didn't happen if you were going to use the thing directly, right? If you were going to eat some eggs, it didn't matter what the purchasing power of eggs in the market was. You could explain why you were willing to give up stuff for those eggs because the subjective value you got from them was higher than the subjective value of what you were giving up. So the explanation could get off the ground, and then it would make sense. But they were worried that it's step one that didn't work with money. So that was the problem that Mises solved. And the solution is what you've probably heard this, especially if you follow the arguments over Bitcoin, is the phrase here is what's called the regression theorem. And so what Mises pointed out was, he said, oh, actually, no, it's not. You're not arguing in a circle. Okay, so Mises was saying, your instincts are correct. We want to use the same framework to all exchange ratios, not just in a hypothetical barter economy, but even if we are trading goods against money, we want to use this new framework that Menger developed because it is much better than the old classical framework. And he said, let me show you how to get over this little speed bump in the beginning of the story. You guys are getting tripped up because you think you're arguing in a circle, but you're not. He said you have to take the time element into account. And so really what's going on, and I'm just going to keep working with the example I introduced a couple minutes ago, if you're going to go to the marketplace and say, okay, I have a cow that I'm going to sell and someone's offering me a gold coin for it, is that a good deal? Should I go ahead and do that? Yeah, you're right. What you're thinking of is, okay, if I sell the cow for this gold coin, then I can go use the gold coin to buy other things. And so where do I get that information? How do I have a frame of reference to know what a gold coin can fetch in the market? It's because yesterday, or in the past, I observed prices and I saw what a gold coin could fetch in the market. And that's why today, in the present, I might give up my cow for a gold coin. So we're explaining today's purchasing power of the gold coin, me giving up a cow for it, by reference to my observations of yesterday's purchasing power of gold. Okay, so notice that's not arguing in a circle. I'm not saying the purchasing power of gold by reference to the purchasing power of gold. What I'm saying is we explain today's purchasing power of gold by reference to yesterday's purchasing power of gold. Okay, so when you bring in that time element, it's no longer a circle. It's not you're not moving in a circle. Okay, so that's what the innovation he made, and so you can see why people call that the regression theorem, because it was going backwards. It was like explaining today's purchasing power of money by reference to yesterday's, and then if you say, well, why did gold have the purchasing power it did yesterday? You say, oh, because people yesterday had just observed its purchasing power the day before, and so you can keep going back in time. So then some critics said, okay, fine, you're right, Mises, it's not arguing in a circle, but now you just opened yourself up to an infinite regress, that you would just have to keep going back and back forever, and you could never stop. So still, clearly, your explanation doesn't make any sense. It doesn't work. And Mises corrected them again and said, no, it's not an infinite regress. We just have to push the explanation back to the point at which the good that is being used as money was not at that time used as money. Okay, and Karl Menger had already provided an explanation for how people could start out in barter, and then through voluntary transactions, some goods could then be adopted as a medium of exchange and then eventually become money as more and more people used it for that purpose. And so they already had a story about how you could start from a pure barter situation and then gradually evolve into one where one or more of the goods was money. And so Mises was saying, we don't have to go back forever. All we have to do is trace the story back to the point at which gold, if we're talking about a gold coin, gold was being valued solely for its ornamental or industrial purposes, not because it was also a medium of exchange. Okay, so that was what his contribution in terms of money. I'm going to run a little bit late here, so let me just do one last thing on calculation for a few minutes, and then I'll turn over to your questions. So the last big point here, and incidentally, for the Independent Institute, I have a new book coming out. I'm not sure what the timetable is. I think they're going to try to get it out before 2015. And it's sort of like a modern restatement of the essential insights of human action aimed at an undergraduate audience. And so I had to reread the whole book again, obviously, to be in a position to sort of crystallize and synthesize the main points. And it really struck me on this reading how much weight Mises puts on this notion of calculation. So you probably would have heard it in terms of what's called the socialist calculation debate, and that's the way I'll explain it to you. But I just want to stress it goes beyond that. Mises wasn't here making a point about the problems of socialism. He instead was trying to show this idea of economic calculation is something very fundamental to human civilization. It's one of the primary tools by which progress occurs, and so it's essential that social scientists, economists in particular, understand what this is and how important it is and why you need institutions that allow for it. Okay, so the way you would normally hear about this is in the context of the socialist calculation debate, because that's kind of how Mises first launched this idea into the profession. So the historical backdrop was, and I'll be real quick here, the historical backdrop is economists were arguing over socialism, right? Some thought socialism, like we're talking here like in the late 1800s, let's say. And so some thought socialism was great and was the wave of the future, and that society would be far more productive if we got rid of this pesky remnants of private property and said we had a bunch of scientists and other experts, rationally plan the economy. And to them, it seemed much more productive rather than the anarchic, decentralized market outcome. And then you had other economists who were favorable to private property and the old order, let's say, who were defending it and saying, "Oh, let's not be radical. Let's not move to socialism because that's very dangerous." And so some of their objections to socialism were things like saying, "Look, for full-blown socialism, if you're going to have the government in charge of everything, that's a lot of power to be putting in the hands of the particular political rulers, and people cannot be trusted with that kind of power. Just look at historically all the horrors that have happened from certain government officials when they got too much political power. And so on that ground alone, you don't want to go full-blown socialism. Okay, so that's sort of like a political nature of man type argument. Another more sort of economic efficiency type argument was to say there's an incentive problem with socialism. That, to put it very succinctly, if what you're doing is having everybody produce everything, you get a big pile of output, and then the government is going to divide it up and apportion it out to people not on the basis of what they contributed, which is how a market works, where you get paid what you produce, but according to some other criterion like need or social merit, well, then you're going to deaden that connection between effort and reward. And so why would people work as hard under a socialist system, right? Why would the workers get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and go to the factories and really bust their butts and so on if the amount of food and shelter and the car they get to drive is determined by something else and not by how hard or how much they produce on the front end? Okay, so that was an incentive argument. So Mises comes along and he gives an entirely new argument that really pushed the debate to a new level. And he said that let me, for the sake of argument, concede that the planners, the people in charge of planning the economy, the socialist central planners, I'll concede for the sake of argument that they're good-hearted people, that they're not power-hungry monsters. They want nothing but to promote the general welfare. Let me also concede that everybody in the system is going to work as hard as possible, that there's no issue of them shirking or gaming the system or anything like that, and they're going to obey whatever rules the leaders give them, or whatever orders they send down the pipeline. Okay, Mises said still a socialist planning board cannot calculate. They cannot evaluate whether a plan they have for taking society's resources and turning them into outputs, they have no basis of determining whether they're making a good use of those resources or not. They can't tell whether they're being efficient in the use of them. So in other words, and he said, this isn't a technological problem. You can't answer that question. He said, I will fully stipulate that all of the best experts in physics, technology, chemistry, and so on, all the best engineers, truthfully answer any question that the central planners can pose to them about the technological, physical relationships involved. And so they can know, for example, that, oh, if you build an apartment complex at this location using this many bricks and so on, well, this is the trade-off involved, and this is how many resources we would need, and that's how we would do it. But you wouldn't then be able to figure out, okay, what implications does that have elsewhere in the system? Okay, you wouldn't know, is that a good use of those resources? Okay, because that's a value proposition. You could know technologically, I can build this apartment complex and use 16,400 bricks, use this much cement, this many panes of glass, but at the end of the day, you wouldn't know, was that a good thing to do? Should I have built that apartment complex using all of those inputs? You wouldn't know, because really what you're asking is the social value of that apartment building more or less than the social value of those inputs? And so that's a value question, and you can't know that. That's not something that empirical scientists can tell you. That's something that involves valuation through markets. So Mises was saying the way the market economy solves that problem is that you have the institution of private property and money, and so you have various entrepreneurs who are providing goods and services to their customers, and they go to the markets for these resources. Like, they bid on workers and they buy raw materials like wood and steel and oil and so on, and they combine them in their own little operation to produce finished goods and services. And so they do get feedback, and specifically it's the market prices quoted in terms of money for all those resources. And so if a particular entrepreneur is making stuff that the finished good is actually not as valuable as the resources going into it. In other words, oh geez, the wood and the shingles and so on that you're using to make that apartment building, they're more urgently needed elsewhere in the economy. The way that message gets across to the builder is that he suffers a loss. The amount that he can sell the apartment for, or if he's renting it out to tenants, the amount that he earns every year from the rental payments compared to his mortgage or whatever, he's losing money, and he realizes I should not have done that because it was too expensive. The amount that I had to pay in the market economy for these resources I can't recoup that cost by selling the finished product. So I stop doing that and I do something else. And so Mises' point was that accounting, that type of fact, the socialists thought was some irrelevant, trivial detail of a market economy that didn't correspond to anything about reality. And Mises was saying, no, that is a real thing. That if your accountant tells you your operation's unprofitable, what that means is the consumers would rather that those resources get deployed elsewhere in the economy. And so that's the way the market economy sort of maintains rationality in the use of resources, is through calculation. Okay, let me stop there, and I'll turn over to your guys' questions.
So, anyone have any questions at the moment? Okay, so there's a lot of students from philosophy, and so I was thinking that they might benefit if you talked a little bit about Mises's utilitarianism, just briefly.
Okay, sure. So yeah, so Mises himself called his position utilitarianism. So later thinkers thought that maybe isn't the best term. Like, really, he was a consequentialist. All right, so if you know that distinction, Mises did not, he was not a crude Benthamite utilitarian who thought you could objectively sort of sum up, a particular action or a particular social institution and say, does it confer more utility than harm on people in the aggregate? I mean, Mises, not only did Mises think that wasn't the way to go, he actually thought those statements were nonsensical. Okay, because coming out of the subjective marginal revolution, utility is a subjective thing. It doesn't make sense to say, does this particular action give more utility to Jim compared to John? So where you're comparing Jim's utility with John's utility, that sort of talk is nonsensical. The way modern economists use that word utility, or at least modern Misesians use that word utility. Okay, because utility and value is a subjective thing that's in your mind. It's idiosyncratic, and it's not something objective. You could compare two people's body weight because that's an objective fact, but you can't compare their subjective happiness. So, but nonetheless, Mises himself did use the term utilitarian, and what he meant was, for example, in some of his writing, he explicitly rejected natural law and natural rights, and he did not base his support for classical liberal values and private property and democracy and things like that. He didn't ground that in a sort of classical tradition of natural law and natural rights, because he said things like, in nature there are no rights. In nature, the tiger eats the prey or whatever, and it's just brutal. And he said that's not at all even a good model for the market economy. That in the market economy, it's not nature in terms of the law of the jungle. On the contrary, there's social cooperation, stuff like that. So Mises actually took pains to distance himself from a lot of people who probably were his allies in terms of their political views, by saying he didn't believe in natural law. He said ultimately the measure of justice is man, and that he was saying the reason I'm a classical liberal, the reason I support democracy, for example, is not that I think people have a natural right to contribute to their government or political system. It was a utilitarian or a pragmatic, let's say, argument. Mises said, look, ultimately, any government is only going to be in power if it enjoys public opinion. Even the most despotic regime, if the majority of people do not support that regime, it will eventually fall. And he said, so if there's no voting, if it's like a hereditary monarchy, for example, well, if the people really don't like the king and they want somebody else in charge, if it's a hereditary monarchy, that means there's got to be a violent revolution. And he said, we don't want that. That wars disrupt social order and social cooperation and threaten civilization. So the way to minimize conflict is to allow the people to periodically vote, because ultimately it's public opinion that's going to determine who's in charge anyway. And so we might as well just make it official so that they don't. So it was you may have heard it's called the for picking the government. Okay, so I'll stop there. If you have a particular follow-up on that, I can answer. But yeah, Mises definitely justified his value system by reference to a consequentialist ethics, not some type of natural law or natural rights.
Anyone else have any questions?
Okay, to follow up on that, would Mises have said that restoring a sense of private property and free market is compatible with government, or would it require a private alternative to government, some sort of anarchism, some sort of free market in territory, where you'd have to go outside of government because it's irredeemable? You'd have to go with, like some of the more modern ideas are the permanent traveler or seasteading. What would you say about minarchism versus anarchism?
Okay, great question. So for sure, I would be. So in case you guys don't know, I'm a full private property anarcho-capitalist, and so it would be great if I thought Mises were too, the way Rothbard was, but he wasn't. All right, so let me just be honest there. It's not merely that you can't find Mises supporting it. He goes out of his way in several places to say the anarchists are naive, and that government is necessary to maintain law and order, basically. Right? That he's saying, yes, the market economy is a voluntary institution, and all of the blessings and achievements of modern civilization come from voluntary cooperation in the framework of a market where there's no coercion. But he's saying the only way that system can work is if people can be assured of their private property rights, and for that you do need the government to stand ready to repel foreign invaders and to beat down and arrest domestic gangsters or just petty criminals. Okay, now having said that though, so he clearly says, makes statements like that in several places in his writing, so you can't claim that, oh, maybe Mises was secretly an anarcho-capitalist. He wasn't. But if you go and look at some of his, some of those passages more carefully to see the context, it's a little bit more nuanced, because, for example, in the passages where he explicitly calls anarchists naive, you get the message from the passage that by that term anarchy, he means somebody who doesn't believe in law enforcement, period. Okay, so he means anarchists who think we don't need laws, or we don't need any kind of institutional judgment saying some people are lawbreakers and some people aren't. We can just all get along, and it's only the establishment putting constraints on us that keeps us down. If we just got rid of those kind of rules, everything would flourish. That's the kind of anarchist that Mises was calling naive. Okay, so Murray Rothbard certainly did not propose a society where there were no laws and there was no law enforcement. It's just he thought that was a task better carried out by competing decentralized agencies that didn't have a monopoly on force. Okay, so that's one point, that Mises' explicit rejection of anarchism actually is not applicable to Murray Rothbard's type of anarchism. He had in mind a more sweeping condemnation of people who rejected the notion of property rights altogether. Also, there's other passages where Mises is quite favorable to secession, where Mises pushes the idea and supports the right of secession down pretty low. I mean, he doesn't. I can't remember the exact phrasing, so I don't want to say because I don't want to mislead you. But it's certainly beyond just the nation state level. That he goes down to like even like the city, saying ultimately it's a practical question, but that look at the people have the right to self-determination, and again, not because Mises thinks they have some abstract right that was given to them by a creator, or that just the nature of the human being himself, he has these rights just because of his nature. No, Mises just thought you can't keep people against their will inside a political organization. That's just going to lead to problems, and so let them go. So if you push that logic and say, okay, well, if Mises thought a group of people who didn't want to be part of a bigger political organization had the right to leave, to exit, well, then wouldn't that logically apply to the individual? And isn't that what Rothbardian anarcho-capitalism is, ultimately, that even down to the individual level, if you don't want to be a part of this political organization, that you can withdraw and say, I'm going to, go be part of something else, that ultimately everybody would be his own little state on his own private property. Okay, so that's another angle people have taken to say, you had the seeds of that in there, but clearly Mises himself never pursued it that far. I would like to think if Mises had just, if you pushed him up 25 years, that probably he would have been a lot more receptive to these ideas. I mean, it's just, I think that's part of it, that if you grew up being a classical liberal and steeped in that tradition, arguing against outright socialists, it would be hard, the ideas of Rothbard and whatever would be hard to interpret. So one last point on this is, I believe that Mises was aware of the kind of stuff Rothbard was kicking out. I mean, Rothbard had written on what we would call anarcho-capitalism before Mises died, and to my knowledge, he never publicly rejected it. And so, you can just say, well, he was being nice and didn't want to snub his big fan and disciple. Who knows? Or maybe he was just saying, wow, this is radical stuff. I'm kind of old at this point, and these ideas are newfangled, and so I'm just going to not really comment on them. I don't know. But that's what I've said is his official positions on that topic.
I just have a question for clarification. Did you say that praxeology is a priori?
Okay, you can get really anal on this. So the actual coming up with new praxeological conclusions, that process is a priori. Some people argue about the status of the action axiom itself, right? So the starting point by which you say it is a true statement that people act, and now what can we a priori deduce from that to say what's the epistemological status of the action axiom. There is some controversy over that. That I think Rothbard differs from Mises on how do we know that statement itself is true. Israel Kirzner reports, and this is just a conversation, so I don't think Mises ever wrote this somewhere, but Israel Kirzner said, Kirzner told this to me, and he said it to other people too, but he said it right to my face, that one time Israel Kirzner, asked Mises, how do we know other people act? And Mises said, by observation. So do with that what you will, but that's what Kirzner said Mises said to him.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Speaking of Israel Kirzner, do you think that there's a good chance he might get the Nobel Prize this year? There's been some talk of that. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't. Every year, Austrians to say, hey, maybe Kirzner's going to get it this year. So there's that. It's the logic is, or the argument is, it goes like this. They say, look at the Nobel Committee surely at some point is going to have to give the prize for work on entrepreneurship, because clearly that's a very important thing, and even mainstream economists now are, having been dragged kicking and screaming over the decades, are recognizing how important entrepreneurship is to economic science, and that's an important thing to study. Just like lately, they've acknowledged with Eleanor Ostrom and stuff about how the importance of institutions and things like that, whereas decades ago mainstream economists didn't care about institutions. They thought that was like sociological gobbledygook or something. But so the argument is, look, eventually they're going to have to give the Nobel Prize in entrepreneurship, and the big gun there is going to be William Baumol, who's written a bunch of, he's a very mainstream guy, but he's solid on entrepreneurship, has written a bunch of stuff, and they're saying, but they can't give it to Baumol and not also give it to Kerzner. They just can't do that. And so that's always the pitch that people make. And like I said, I mean, I've heard it too this year that there's buzz that, oh, maybe Kerzner's going to get, but I'm just telling you, I've heard there have been several times in the past where I've heard that buzz, oh yeah, Kerzner's probably going to get it this year, and he hasn't. So I don't know how much validity to put in those anticipations.
Okay. So do we have any more questions? Okay. Looks like we don't have any more questions, but thank you so much for coming. I really hope everyone got a lot out of it. I know I greatly enjoyed the talk. And so one last final point. Is there any work of Mises that you would suggest is a good starting point, a good introductory text? Because lots of people here aren't too familiar with it. Okay, yeah, sure. Let me not pick one because I know it sounds like you have a varied mix of students there. So let me give you some. If you want to just have a short, very readable introduction to his worldview, I highly recommend. It's called Liberalism in the Classical Tradition, and so there you'll see his viewpoint on liberalism and why he is a classical liberal. And there's a lot of economics in there, but it's not a work on economic theory. And so it's a very readable for Mises. It's a very readable introduction, and it's short. That's the other virtue of it. Human action is the definitive magnum opus work, but it's pretty long. So if you're an economist, I definitely would suggest you try to read that, at least large portions of it, if you can. And I have a study guide. If you just Google Robert Murphy Human Action Study Guide, it's free online to help you work through it. But that's really the definitive economics work that he made. And I'm trying to think if there's Richard Ebling has a collection called Money, Method, and the Market Process, and I think there's some standalone articles by Mises in there that are pretty good if you just want an introduction to his thought. Okay, great. So thank you so much. Thank you, and we really hope you have a good day, and we're really glad that you talked to us. Okay, thanks, guys.